For 22 years, the world watched a strange story unfold around Leonardo DiCaprio, a man praised as one of the greatest actors of his generation, yet repeatedly denied Hollywood's highest honor. He was nominated again and again, his performances dissected in film schools and celebrated by critics, but the golden statue always went to someone else. To the public, it became a running joke. To him, it became something heavier, a silent pressure that followed him from film set to film set. People saw the fame, the wealth, the glamorous life, but few understood the private emptiness that can grow when a person achieves everything except the one thing they secretly believe will make them feel complete. Long before the memes, before the headlines, before the standing ovations and disappointments, there was just a boy growing up in a rough corner of Los Angeles, watching his mother struggle to survive and quietly promising himself that one day he would rescue her from that life. East Hollywood in the 1970s and 1980s was not the sparkling dream factory shown in movies. It was a neighborhood where poverty and danger lived side by side, where sirens were a nightly soundtrack and survival came before ambition. Leonardo's mother, Ermeline Indenberken, raised him alone in a small apartment near Hollywood Boulevard and Western Avenue, working tirelessly just to pay rent and buy groceries. She had come to America from Germany chasing opportunity, only to find herself trapped in a cycle of low-paying jobs and constant anxiety about money. Still, she protected her son fiercely, shielding him from as much hardship as she could while encouraging his imagination and curiosity. Leonardo remembered seeing things on the streets that no child should see, moments that forced him to grow up faster than he should have. Those experiences did not harden him into bitterness. Instead, they planted a deep hunger to escape and to create a life where fear did not dictate every decision. His father, George DiCaprio, remained part of his life, but from a distance. An underground comic book artist with unconventional ideas, he introduced Leonardo to art, creativity, and a way of thinking that did not follow traditional rules. Weekends with his father were colorful and inspiring, but they could not replace the stability missing during the rest of the week. Leonardo learned early that love can exist alongside absence, that support sometimes comes in fragments rather than in a steady presence. At school, he struggled to fit in. He was intelligent and curious, but restless, unable to focus on lessons that felt disconnected from the harsh reality outside the classroom. Teachers saw flashes of brilliance mixed with defiance. Other children noticed his worn clothes and the uncertainty that followed him like a shadow. By the age of 10, he had already absorbed a lesson many adults spend their lives learning. The world does not automatically reward effort, and if you want something better, you must fight for it relentlessly. His mother became his anchor and his motivation. She took him to auditions across Los Angeles, often traveling for hours on buses because they could not afford a car. Waiting rooms were filled with hopeful children and exhausted parents, all chasing the same distant dream. Rejection became routine. Casting directors dismissed him with polite smiles, telling them they would call even though they never did. Each disappointment could have broken a child's confidence, but his mother transformed it into resilience. She would squeeze his hand and remind him that persistence mattered more than approval. Watching her refuse to give up, Leonardo learned that failure is not a verdict, but a test of endurance. He promised himself that one day her sacrifices would mean something, that he would create a life where she no longer had to struggle. When he began landing small roles in commercials and television, the work was not glamorous. It was simply a way to keep going, to stay in the game long enough for a real opportunity to appear. At 12 years old, he entered the audition circuit seriously, facing rooms full of children who seemed more polished, more confident, more connected. He collected rejection after rejection, yet something inside him refused to quit. That stubborn determination would become one of his defining traits as an actor. Small television parts followed, including appearances on shows that paid the bills but did not satisfy his artistic ambitions. He wanted roles that mattered, characters with depth and pain and truth. The breakthrough came when he was cast opposite Robert De Niro in the film This Boy's Life. Acting alongside one of his heroes terrified him, but it also awakened something powerful. Instead of shrinking under pressure, he channeled his own childhood fears and frustrations into the performance, earning critical praise that finally made the industry notice him. Soon after, he delivered a haunting performance in What's Eating Gilbert Grape alongside Johnny Depp, transforming himself completely into a vulnerable teenager with developmental disabilities. The role earned him his first Academy Award nomination at just 19 years old, a moment that should have felt like victory. Instead, it became the beginning of a long journey defined by expectation. He had proven he was more than a child actor, more than a television face, but success introduced a new kind of pressure. Hollywood began watching him closely, waiting to see whether he would become a serious artist or fade into the long list of former prodigies who could not sustain early promise. Fame arrived suddenly and overwhelmingly after Romeo and Juliet and especially Titanic, turning him into a global icon almost overnight. Fans screamed his name wherever he went. Magazines printed his face endlessly. The world saw a charming young star living a dream. Yet inside, he felt trapped by the image others projected onto him. He wanted to be respected, not idolized. He wanted challenging roles, not romantic stereotypes. The boy who once feared being forgotten now feared being misunderstood. The contradiction defined the next phase of his life. He had escaped poverty but entered a different kind of prison, one built from fame, expectation, and the constant need to prove himself worthy of the opportunities he had fought so hard to earn. Behind every performance, every risky role, every physical transformation was still that child from East Hollywood trying to keep a promise to his mother. Success did not erase the past, it amplified it. The hunger that once drove him to auditions now drove him to push his body and mind further than most actors would dare. He believed that if he worked hard enough, if he sacrificed enough, he would finally feel secure, finally feel that he had justified everything his mother endured for him. What he did not yet understand was that achievement does not always silence doubt. Sometimes it makes the silence louder. And so the story of Leonardo DiCaprio is not simply about awards or fame or box office records. It is about a boy who learned too early that life can be fragile, who turned that fear into ambition, and who spent decades chasing a sense of completion that always seemed just out of reach. The world saw the superstar. Few saw the child still searching for proof that the struggle had meaning. As Leonardo DiCaprio's fame grew, so did the strange mythology surrounding his personal life, especially his relationships. To the public, he was not just a movie star anymore, but a symbol of unattainable success, beauty, and mystery. Yet behind the flashing cameras and glamorous headlines was a man who seemed unable or unwilling to build anything permanent when it came to love. Friends described him as charming, loyal, and generous, but also guarded, as if a part of him remained that cautious boy from East Hollywood who learned early that stability could disappear overnight. Relationships came in his life like seasons, intense and dazzling, but always temporary. The pattern became so obvious that even people who did not follow celebrity news could recite it. Leonardo dated young, breathtakingly beautiful women, and the relationships ended before they reached a certain point of seriousness. To some observers, it looked like a lifestyle choice of a man intoxicated by endless options. To others, it seemed like fear, a refusal to risk emotional vulnerability in a world where everything he loved could be taken or exposed. The truth was likely more complicated. Fame had frozen his life in a strange way. While his career matured, earning respect from directors and critics, his personal world remained locked in a loop of parties, premieres, and brief romances. Every time he stepped outside, he was not just a man, but a spectacle. Trust became a rare currency. Was someone interested in him as a person, or as the legend whose name opened every door? Even ordinary moments, dinner at a restaurant, a walk on a beach, turned into public events documented by photographers hiding behind bushes or crowds gathering with phones raised. Over time, privacy stopped feeling like a right and started feeling like a fantasy. Under those conditions, building a normal relationship was almost impossible. It was easier to keep things light, controlled, temporary. While tabloids reduced his dating life to a punchline, Leonardo focused on work with a near-obsessive intensity. After finally winning the Oscar, he did not slow down as many expected. Instead, he became more selective, choosing projects carefully, sometimes disappearing from screens for years at a time. He no longer needed to prove he was a serious actor, yet he still chased roles that challenged him physically and emotionally. Acting was the one place where he felt grounded, where the noise of fame faded and only the craft remained. On set, he was not a global icon, but a collaborator, a performer chasing truth in imaginary circumstances. Crew members often noted how seriously he treated every detail, how he stayed in character between takes, how he listened more than he spoke. It was as if the discipline of acting was his way of maintaining control over a life that otherwise felt uncontrollable. Outside of film, he continued pouring energy into environmental activism, even as criticism persisted. He traveled to endangered ecosystems, met with scientists, funded conservation programs, and used his platform to amplify voices that rarely reached mainstream audiences. For Leonardo, the environment was not an abstract cause, but a tangible connection to his childhood memories of nature before it was consumed by concrete and pollution. Yet he also understood the contradictions people pointed out. The same global fame that allowed him to influence millions also forced him into a lifestyle that contradicted his message. He existed in a paradox where every action could be interpreted as either heroic or hypocritical, depending on who was watching. Living under that microscope required emotional armor, and over the years he developed it, learning to absorb criticism without letting it derail his mission. Despite the wealth, the accolades, and the global recognition, those closest to him sometimes sensed a lingering restlessness. Success had answered many questions, but not all of them. The drive that pushed him out of poverty did not disappear once he became rich. It simply changed shape. Instead of fighting for survival, he fought for meaning. What does a person chase when they already have everything they once dreamed of? For Leonardo, the answer seemed to shift constantly. New roles, new causes, new experiences, anything that prevented him from feeling stagnant. He traveled widely, surrounding himself with longtime friends who knew him before the world did, people who could still treat him like a normal human being rather than an untouchable star. Yet even in those private circles, the shadow of his public persona never fully vanished. Conversations inevitably drifted back to movies, to fame, to expectations. He could not escape being Leonardo DiCaprio because the world would not allow it. Every new generation discovered Titanic, The Wolf of Wall Street, or The Revenant, and projected their own image onto him. To some, he was still Jack Dawson, forever young and romantic. To others, he was the ruthless Jordan Belfort or the suffering Hugh Glass. Few saw the quiet, introspective man who preferred documentaries to blockbusters in his free time and spoke passionately about science and history. The character he played for the world had become so convincing that even he sometimes struggled to separate it from his real identity. In rare interviews, he hinted at this internal conflict. He spoke about the strange loneliness of fame, about how success can isolate rather than connect, about the difficulty of forming genuine relationships when everyone already thinks they know you. These are not complaints, but reflections, the observations of someone who had spent decades living inside a life most people only imagine. He understood his privilege, but he also understood its cost. Every dream achieved had closed certain doors forever. The ordinary experiences of anonymity, spontaneity, and simple privacy were gone, replaced by a carefully managed existence where every move could become a headline. As he moved further into his 40s, the urgency that once defined him began to soften into contemplation. He started producing more films, supporting younger filmmakers, and exploring stories that might not have attracted his younger self. There was a sense that he was thinking about legacy, not just in terms of awards or box office numbers, but in terms of impact. What would remain when the cameras stopped rolling? What would people say about him when he was no longer the most famous man in the room? These questions did not haunt him the way the Oscar once had. but they lingered quietly in the background, shaping his choices in subtle ways. Leonardo DiCaprio had spent his life climbing towards something he could never fully define. When he finally reached the summit of fame, he discovered there was no finish line, only another horizon waiting in the distance. The boy who once rode 3 buses with his mother to auditions had become a man who could travel anywhere in the world instantly. Yet part of him was still searching for the same thing he wanted back then: security, purpose, and a sense that the struggle meant something. The journey had transformed him, rewarded him, and isolated him all at once. And as the years passed, it became clear that the real story of Leonardo DiCaprio was not about awards or relationships or even movies. It was about a human being trying to understand what it means to have everything and still feel like something essential is missing. As the years moved forward, Leonardo DiCaprio began to realize that time was the one opponent he could never outwork, outsmart, or outrun. In Hollywood, youth is currency, relevance is survival, and reinvention is the only defense against becoming a memory. He had watched it happen to others. Actors who once ruled the box office slowly fading into supporting roles, then cameos, then silence. The industry that builds legends is the same one that replaces them without hesitation. For someone who had spent his entire life fighting to be seen, the idea of disappearing carried a quiet terror. Not because he needed attention, but because acting had become the language through which he understood himself. Without it, he was not sure who he would be. This awareness changed the way he approached his craft. He became more patient, more deliberate, less interested in quantity, and more focused on meaning. Each role had to justify the time it took from his life. He turned down major studio projects that promised enormous paychecks, but little artistic challenge, choosing instead to collaborate with directors who pushed him into uncomfortable territory. Discomfort, he had learned, was where growth lived. Comfort was the enemy of authenticity. That philosophy traced back to his childhood, to the instability that forced him to adapt constantly. While other actors sought security in familiar roles, Leonardo gravitated toward characters who were broken, conflicted, or morally ambiguous. They reflected the complexity he saw in the world and in himself. At the same time, he became increasingly aware of his influence beyond film. Younger actors looked up to him not just for his performances, but for the way he navigated fame without self-destruction. Hollywood history was filled with cautionary tales. Talented people consumed by addiction, ego, or the pressure of constant scrutiny. Leonardo had witnessed some of those stories up close. Early in his career, the party culture surrounding young stars threatened to pull him into a lifestyle that could have derailed everything. There were nights of excess, reckless decisions, moments he rarely spoke about publicly. But somewhere along the line, he stepped back, recognizing how easily the path could end in tragedy. Work became his anchor, the thing that kept him from drifting too far into chaos. Despite that discipline, he never fully escaped the perception that he lived in a different reality from ordinary people. Wealth on a scale created a bubble where everyday problems, rent, bills, job security, simply did not exist. Critics argued that this distance made it impossible for him to truly understand the struggles he portrayed on screen. Supporters countered that empathy does not require identical experiences, only imagination and compassion. Leonardo himself rarely addressed the debate directly. Instead, he let his performances speak, immersing himself so deeply in characters that audiences could feel their pain regardless of his personal circumstances. Acting, for him, was not about pretending, but about accessing emotional truths that transcended biography. Privately, he remained deeply connected to his parents, especially his mother, whose sacrifices had shaped every step of his journey. No matter how large his world became, he returned to her as a reminder of where he came from. She attended premieres, award ceremonies, and quiet family gatherings, always the same steady presence she had been when they rode buses across Los Angeles. Their bond grounded him in a way nothing else could. Success had given him the power to provide for her, to ensure she would never again face the hardships of their early years. In that sense, he had fulfilled the promise he made as a child. Yet the emotional debt he felt toward her never disappeared. Gratitude, he believed, was not something you paid off once, but something you carried for life. As technology transformed the world, Leonardo also witnessed the changing relationship between celebrities and the public. Social media erased the distance that once separated stars from audiences, creating a constant stream of commentary, praise, and criticism. He approached these platforms cautiously, aware that every post could be dissected and misinterpreted. Unlike younger actors who built careers through online visibility, he maintained an air of mystery, revealing only fragments of his personal life. That restraint, while frustrating to fans hungry for intimacy, preserved a sense of dignity that had become rare in the age of oversharing. He understood that mystery was part of what allowed audiences to believe in the characters he played. If they knew everything about him, the illusion would shatter. There were moments, however, when the isolation of fame weighed heavily. Watching friends build families, settle into routines, and experience milestones he had postponed stirred a quiet introspection. He wondered what sacrifices were invisible to the public, what parts of life he had traded for a career that demanded total commitment. The applause, the recognition, the influence, none of it replaced the simple comfort of belonging somewhere without conditions. Yet he also knew that choosing a different path would have meant abandoning the dream that had defined him since childhood. Regret was a luxury he could not afford, so he learned to live with ambiguity, accepting that fulfillment and longing could coexist. Professionally, he began exploring projects that addressed historical injustices, environmental crises, and social issues, using storytelling as a way to spark conversation rather than just entertain. Producing allowed him to shape narratives from behind the scenes, supporting voices that might otherwise struggle to be heard. This transition reflected a broader evolution from performer to architect, from someone who interpreted stories to someone who helped create them. It also hinted at a future where his legacy would extend beyond his own performances, influencing the industry in ways audiences might never fully see. Through all these changes, one constant remained: the relentless curiosity that drove him as a child. He read extensively, watched documentaries, engaged in long discussions with scientists, historians, and artists. Learning was his way of staying alive to the world, of preventing success from calcifying into complacency. He feared becoming someone who believed he had nothing left to discover. Curiosity kept him humble, reminding him that no matter how much he achieved, there was always more complexity beneath the surface. Leonardo DiCaprio's life had become a paradox of motion and stillness. He traveled constantly, yet searched for a place that felt like home. He achieved global recognition, yet guarded his privacy fiercely. He influenced millions, yet wrestled with questions that had no audience. The boy who once dreamed of escape had escaped so completely that he sometimes longed for the simplicity he left behind. But life does not allow reverse journeys. It only moves forward, carrying with it the echoes of every choice made along the way. By the time he entered the later stage of his career, Leonardo understood that legacy is not something you control. It is a story others tell about you after you are gone, shaped by fragments of truth and interpretation. All he could do was continue choosing projects that mattered to him, supporting causes he believed in, and maintaining the relationships that reminded him he was more than a symbol. Whether the world saw him as a legend, a contradiction, or simply an actor was ultimately beyond his control. What mattered was whether he could look at his life and recognize the boy who started the journey, still present somewhere beneath the layers of fame. In the quiet moments between projects, when the cameras stopped rolling and the noise of the world faded to a distant hum, Leonardo DiCaprio confronted the one role he had never fully understood: himself. For decades, he had disappeared into other lives, other voices, other tragedies and triumphs. Acting had given him permission to feel everything without having to explain anything. But alone, without a script, Without direction, there was no character to hide behind. Just a man in his 40s, then his 50s, staring at the invisible cost of becoming an icon. Fame had given him access to everything except normalcy. He could stand in the ruins of ancient civilizations, dive into untouched oceans, walk through halls of power where decisions shaping the planet were made. Yet he could not sit anonymously in a crowded cafe or take a quiet walk through a city without eyes tracking his every move. The ordinary life he once wanted to escape had become the one thing permanently out of reach. It was a realization both absurd and heartbreaking. The boy who dreamed of more had achieved it beyond imagination, only to discover that more came with invisible walls. He began to think about legacy not as awards or box office numbers, but as impact measured in quieter ways. The forests preserved because of his funding. The films that changed how people understood history or injustice. The young actors who saw his career and believed longevity was possible without surrendering integrity. These were the things that would outlast headlines. Awards gathered dust. Cultural influence echoed across generations. Yet even as he reframed success, the question lingered. What happens when the dream that carried you through life is no longer enough to fill it? Achievement, he learned, is not a permanent state of fulfillment. It is a moment, intense and intoxicating, that inevitably fades. After the Oscar, after the global recognition, after proving every doubter wrong, he woke up the next morning still the same person, still carrying the same uncertainties. Victory had not erased the doubts planted in childhood. It had only proven that external validation could never fully silence them. Friends noticed a subtle shift in him. He listened more than he spoke. He seemed less interested in being the center of attention and more focused on observing the world around him. The restless energy that once drove him to chase every opportunity softened into something closer to contemplation. It was not resignation, but evolution. The understanding that life's meaning is not found in constant acceleration, but in knowing when to slow down. He also began to reconnect with parts of himself that had been neglected during the years of relentless ambition. Art, music, long conversations without agendas, moments of stillness that allowed reflection rather than performance. For someone who had spent a lifetime performing intensity, learning to exist without it was both uncomfortable and liberating. He realized that identity built solely on achievement is fragile. When the work stops, so does the sense of self. To survive beyond the spotlight, he needed to rediscover who he was without applause. The public, however, rarely allows its icons to evolve quietly. Every appearance sparked speculation. Every relationship became a headline. Every choice was analyzed for hidden meaning. People projected their own expectations onto him. Environmental hero, eternal bachelor, tortured artist, Hollywood royalty. Each label simplified a life too complex to fit into any single narrative. Leonardo understood that he could never fully control how he was perceived. The character the world saw would always differ from the person he experienced internally. What gave him peace was the knowledge that his journey had never truly been about fame or trophies. It had been about survival, first literal, then emotional, then existential. Acting had been the vehicle that carried him out of poverty, but resilience was the engine that kept him moving when success threatened to paralyze him. The same determination that pushed a child through endless rejections had pushed a man through decades of scrutiny and expectation. Looking back, he could trace a line from the cracked sidewalks of East Hollywood to the grand stages of international cinema, a path marked not by luck but by persistence. Every setback had shaped him. Every criticism forced introspection. Every triumph revealed new challenges. The story was not one of flawless ascent, but of constant recalibration, learning how to remain human in an environment designed to turn people into symbols. And perhaps that was the real victory. Not the Oscar, not the billions at the box office, not the global recognition, but the ability to endure without losing the core of who he was. The boy who rode buses with his mother, who promised himself he would build a better life for them both, was still there. Older, wiser, carrying scars invisible to the world, but still driven by the same quiet fire. In the end, Leonardo DiCaprio's life became a paradox that no headline could fully capture. He was one of the most recognized faces on Earth, and yet profoundly private. A symbol of success who openly questioned the meaning of success. A man who spent decades chasing validation only to discover that fulfillment comes from acceptance, not applause. The world may always see him as the actor, the activist, the celebrity, the legend. But behind all of that is simply a human being who learned, through extraordinary circumstances, the same lesson everyone eventually faces, that identity cannot be built on what others give you, only on what you discover within yourself. And somewhere, in a quiet room far from cameras and crowds, Leonardo DiCaprio continues the only journey that truly matters, not toward another award, another role, or another achievement, but toward understanding the person he became along the way.